This week, we got the most recent numbers on inflation, the ones the Fed pays attention to, and core PCE came in just about where expected, showing inflation growing 2.4% year over year. After the most recent numbers, we sat down with San Francisco Fed President Mary Daly and asked her how she squares the strong growth and jobs numbers with the relatively weak consumer sentiment figures.
When you think about how hard it is to work as hard as you can, work multiple jobs, and not be able to afford things one month to the next, that has a psychological toll that I think we can't underestimate. And as the economy continues to make gains and we bring inflation down, that scar, if you will start to heal. But people need that certainty, and that's why we keep saying we're not done until we're done. You know, these good inflation data that we're seeing, that's not price stability. Two is.
For people in financial media and on Wall Street, the number one issue is rate cuts.
Yes, that is their number one issue. But we work for the American people, not necessarily not for markets. So.
But explain it to in your summary of economic projections, the last one. You have 3 in for the year. That's a projection. It's not a promise. And some people think you should have more. Maybe some people think you should have less. Why are we talking about rate cuts at all, given the strength of the economy? I mean, the economy seems to be doing just fine with the rate cuts you put in place.
So we put a projection out about what we think we'll need to do if the economy evolves as we expect it to. So what's the expectation? Inflation continues to come down gradually. The labor market and the economy slow but don't tip over. And then it would be appropriate, as inflation comes down, to bring the nominal rate of interest down to make sure we're not holding on even tighter, because we want to avoid the following. We want to avoid holding on all the way to 2%, putting policy very tight, and then cause an unnecessary downturn that you give people lower inflation, but you cost them their jobs. So that's a balancing act that means we have to be calibrating. So I want to just be clear, though, you don't see many Fed officials, including myself, talking about rate cuts. You see us talking about restoring price stability, bringing inflation down, being data dependent, looking at the full balance, being patient and methodical. So I do think that message is clear. It's not always what people necessarily want to hear, but it is a clear message that we've been on.
I'm not expecting you to tell us when you're going to cut rates, but let me ask a different question. I'm old enough to remember when Potter Stewart in the Supreme Court said about obscenity, you'll know it when you see it. How will you know it when you see it? That's the time we should start cutting rates.
That's a great question. So what I look at is what I think of as a dashboard of indicators. And the dashboard of indicators has the published data, which everybody focuses on, but those tend to be data points. And you don't want to be data point dependent, you want to be data dependent. So you have to look underneath the hood of those data and really see what's driving them. And also you have to talk to people. And what I'm looking for right now is for the published data to continue to gradually slow and inflation to gradually come down. But for when the behavior, when I talk to firms, when I talk to businesses, et cetera, that they're saying, oh yes, we're not going to continue to raise prices. Oh yes, we see input costs coming down. Workers saying, we see jobs, we want to stick with our employer. We are not worried about 5% wage growth because we don't feel inflation's going to continue. I'm looking for those things to all come together and form a collage of evidence, if you will, that we are on the path to price stability sustainably. I'm seeing parts of that. I see a lot of green shoots, as we like to say, but we're not there yet.
You talked about your dashboard. Let me ask about one specific figure on your dashboard, and that is inflation numbers. There's some concern now that maybe inflation's overstated. I've talked to a couple of people who are pretty active in real estate, commercial real estate, in recent days who said the owner equivalent rent is overstating inflation as a practical matter. Somebody said actually recently on this program as much as 1.7 to 1.8%. Are you concerned that maybe we're overstating inflation right now?
So that's a really terrific question, and it might help for me to just talk about how I look at the data. So there are multiple inflation indicators, and you can unpack all of them into what's driving them. But we can't just look at those published inflation data to see the story. We have to actually go into communities and look at what's happening with local house price appreciation, what's happening with rental price appreciation. And there you do see the elements of the slowing you would expect to see. So I actually am growing more confident that housing inflation, shelter inflation, rental inflation are coming down. The speed at which they come down is still unknown, but I'm not seeing signs that they're picking back up yet.
One of the hot questions about the economy right now is why productivity numbers have appeared to rise and whether it has anything to do with generative AI.
For the Fed, AI is about productivity. Productivity is basically the amount of stuff you can sell compared to the cost of producing it. By making more stuff or offering more services at less cost, companies' profit margins increase. They can pay more, and our standard of living rises. There were big gains in productivity coming out of World War II, and again as personal computers spread throughout the economy in the 1990s. But those productivity booms faded, and wage gains were muted for years after the great financial crisis. The pandemic upended the usual path of post-recession productivity. But as its effects have also faded and inflation has fallen, productivity is rising again. Is that because AI is beginning to affect business? We don't know, and neither does the Fed. But that's the assumption based on what's happened in the past. And there is some anecdata suggesting it is happening again. E-commerce payment system provider Klarna put out a press release this week claiming its AI system is doing the work of 700 agents in 20% of the time. UBS analysts estimate AI has already raised productivity growth to almost 3% over the past 6 months. The implications are enormous. As the saying goes, big if true.
Now, the thing I learned, I went to the Fed to work for the first time in 1996. So I'm on the ground in the Bay Area looking at this productivity boom. And what I learned from that period of time is that it's not about the innovation itself, it's about how people use it. And if we use this effectively and well, and we make sure we have the right rules and regulations and work together on it, then it has a chance to create a productivity boom. If we don't, then it will just be the next newest thing that ends in some productivity gains but not lasting productivity growth. And I think that's really the choice point we're at. So yes, I see it, but I'm unwilling to say this is the next productivity boom. But I think the little seeds of it are certainly out there.
Understanding it's way too soon to tell for sure, still to think about the possibilities. What possible effects could this have on economic policy, and particularly monetary policy? Because if you really do have abundant productivity growth, that affects your inflation calculation, does it not?
Absolutely. So one of the things we saw last year, and I think it's useful to just look at last year, we had two things that were surprising. We had greater labor supply, based on just the domestic workforce increasing their labor force participation, and we had more immigration than many had penciled in. So that's a positive in terms of the number of workers interested in working. The second thing we had, though, was this boom in productivity growth that you noted. You put those two things together, and we were able to grow faster without being inflationary. And I think that is the number one question on my mind for policy. Are we working with a fixed pie that's growing slowly? The economy's expanding slowly. Or are we getting something on the productivity side that allows us to grow more quickly without inflation rising up? And that's the question for policy. If we get the productivity boom, then like in the 1990s, we don't have to try to slow growth in order to bring inflation down.